Hello, and welcome to today's presentation entitled, We Left One War and Came to Another, Double-Edged Sword of Resettlement in Urban Communities for Refugee Youth. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing expert speaker series about building resiliency and supporting youth affected by trauma and community violence. I'd like to thank our presenters for joining us and for all the work they put in to preparing for today's discussion. I will now share a brief bio about today's presenters. Both bring a diverse range of insights and expertise related to refugee resettlement in urban communities. First, Saida Abdi is a clinical social worker and expert in refugee trauma and resilience. Ms. Abdi has master's degrees in social work from Boston University and communications from Carleton College. She's pursuing her doctoral degree in sociology and social work from Boston University and currently serves as adjunct faculty at Boston College's School of Social Work, where she teaches about cross-cultural issues. Ms. Abdi is a native of Somalia and a former refugee. She has worked for over 20 years supporting refugee youth and families, ranging from school-based program work to youth resettlement and engagement. For the past 8 years, she has worked at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston's Children's Hospital, focusing on community-based participatory research and intervention development. Ms. Abdi has organized trainings for educators, policymakers, clinicians, and community leaders to help promote resilience and reduce risk behaviors among refugee youth. She is trained in trauma systems therapy, or TST, and is a key part of the development team for TST for refugees, and has expertise in the development of culturally responsive mental health services. Thank you, Ms. Abdi, for joining us. Our second presenter today, welcome. Our second presenter today is Dr. Alicia Miller. Dr. Miller is based at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston's Children's Hospital as well, where as a research associate she conducts community-based participatory research and assists with intervention development. Dr. Miller is an assistant in psychology with the Department of Psychiatry at Boston Children's Hospital and instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Boston University and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Center for PTSD in the Behavioral Science Division within VA Boston Healthcare System. Dr. Miller is also trained in trauma systems therapy, or TST, and is an integral part as well in the development of team for TST for refugees. Her research interests are trauma exposure, PTSD, identity development, family conflict and cohesion, and effects of these on family and community functioning. Reducing mental health disparities among refugees and immigrant groups is a key area of interest for her, as well as promoting healthy adjustment during and after resettlement. Welcome, Dr. Miller. Before proceeding, Dr. Miller would first like to share a few acknowledgments. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us today for our webinar, We Left One War and Came to Another, the Double-Edged Sword of Resettlement in Urban Communities for Refugee Youth. We welcome you to the presentation and are looking forward to an enriching discussion following it. We would like to start by acknowledging Jaleel and Lisa. Thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this incredible Community Violence in Urban Youth Windows into Risk and Resiliency speaker series. We would next like to thank our community partners at the Refugee Immigrant and Assistance Center here in Boston, Massachusetts, without whom our work could not be done. We would like to thank our funders, SAMHSA, who without their support we would not be able to do the work we do or make the impact that we've been able to do. And finally, we would also like to thank Teresa Betancourt at the Harvard School of Public Health. She is a collaborator of ours. And lastly, we'd also like to thank the NCTSN, which provides us a network of friends and colleagues who are all dedicated to raising the standard of care for traumatized youth. Next slide, please.
So this series of NCTSN webinars is available on the Learning Center with archived presentations from previous webinars, as well as upcoming presentations noted there in the future. So check back on that page There is a webinar expected to be coming up in December, as well as another two in 2016. So check back on that homepage for more information. Next slide, please.
I would like to take a moment to tell you about the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital, which is a SAMHSA-funded treatment and services adaptation center of the NCTSN. We are dedicated to understanding and promoting the healthy adjustment of refugee children and adolescents who have resettled in the United States. In partnership with refugee communities and agencies, we have three main goals. First, we build culturally appropriate prevention and intervention in-person and online programs that address the experience of war and violence prior to and after resettlement, as well as the ongoing acculturative and resettlement stressors that refugee families experience. Second, we conduct research. Not only do we evaluate our interventions, but we also conduct mixed method research to better understand pathways to and away from violence for refugee youth. And lastly, we develop training and resources to assist refugee families and service providers working with refugee youth, families, and communities.
Alicia, thank you. Alicia, thank you for that. And before we proceed, I just want to make sure we have a few bases covered by participants. If participants would please note the following information, and then we can start proceeding with the presentation. So if you experience technical difficulties at any point, you can send an email to help@nctsn.org. The format of this presentation does not allow for you to speak directly to presenters. However, you may ask a question at any point during the presentation by clicking on the blue button labeled Ask a Question, or if you're on the phone, you can send an email directly to question@nctsn.org. Please take a moment at the end of the webinar to complete the post-presentation evaluation survey. Participant feedback is helpful for the development of future presentations and for the presenters who have taken the time today to share and develop the presentation. For those seeking CE credits for attending this webinar, you will first need to complete the post-presentation evaluation survey, at which time you'll be prompted to complete a CE post-test. After passing the post-test, you can print a CE certificate. Today's presentation will be archived on the NCTSN Learning Center website for future viewing. You can also return to the website to complete the CE post-test and print the certificate at a later time. Okay, Dr. Miller, I will now turn it back to you to continue the presentation.
Excellent, thank you. So just as a general overview, our webinar will have three parts today. In the first part, my colleague, Saida Abdi, will provide a definition of what it means to be a refugee, describe the landscape of refugees in the United States, and discuss risk and protective factors for these youth. We will then describe the refugee experience from a socio-ecological frame in order to provide a larger context for community violence and refugee youth resettled in urban areas. In the second part, I will describe in more detail what can be done to enhance youth adjustment, and importantly, what can be done to protect against the harmful effects for trauma and community violence. I will detail a promising intervention, Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees, or TSTR, a prevention intervention designed to address the experience and needs of refugee youth and their families in resettlement. And finally, just before our lively and enriching discussion, Saida will detail what we believe to be the important takeaways from this webinar. I will now like to turn the presentation over to you, Saida. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Anne, for inviting us and giving us this wonderful opportunity to talk about refugee youth and risk and resilience. I also would like to clarify something before I am accused of claiming degrees that I don't have, which is that I have a master's in communication from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, which is different than Carleton College in Minnesota. Just want to clarify that. Thank you. And I am going now to talk about what is a refugee. We talk about refugees, but many providers meet youth who are immigrants. So the question is what is a refugee and how are they different from other groups, immigrant youth that we see? And refugee is actually defined by a UN convention. Article 1 of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees formally defines refugee as someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality and is unable to return owing to such a fear. Is unable or unwilling to return or to avail themselves of the protection of that country due to fear of being persecuted. So this is really important. The refugee is a special status. It's a status that's unique. Of course, when we are in practice and we're seeing youth, we may see other youth who come as asylum seekers, unaccompanied minors, as immigrants, who have similar histories or trauma exposure as refugees. But what defines refugees is that they arrive here with a special status that is first guaranteed by the UN, and then a country like the US brings them here as refugees. So when they arrive, they have that status. For asylum, an asylee actually has the same well-founded fear of persecution, except that they have already arrived here, and that's how that status is guaranteed. After fleeing from violence in their home countries, refugees come to new countries with the hope of finding peace and safety that will hopefully give them a better future. Next slide, please. So I wanted to say first about refugee trends. So where are they? Where are they coming from? What are the numbers? In 2014, there were 19.5 million refugees worldwide. Developing countries host most of those refugees. About approximately 86% of the world refugees live in developing countries. If you think about it, if you're Somali and you're a refugee and you're trying to escape from war in your native country, you're more likely to be in Ethiopia or Kenya rather than in the U.S. If you are Bhutanese, you're more likely to be in Nepal. If you're Syrian, you're much more likely to be in Iraq. And so for that reason, the majority of world's refugees live in developing countries, mostly in neighboring countries to where they are. But of course, lately, if you have been watching the news, we have been seeing multiple incidents of refugees dying in boats in Europe, trying to escape developing countries into Western Europe, into the U.S., and we see refugees dying trying to cross the border here in the desert and dying of hunger. And so refugees are coming to our streets and to our neighborhoods, even though the majority of them may live in other countries right now. In 2014, over 51% of refugees were under the age of 18. So the majority of refugees worldwide are very young kids. Next one. Again, if we look at this, you can see that, well, I just said refugee trends in the United States between 2009 and 2011. The majority of those who came were under the age of 24, so over 40% were over that age. I just want to make another point, which is that many refugees spend many, many years in refugee camps. They literally wait a lifetime trying to come here. They're very resilient. They overcome unbelievable, incredible odds. They face money, they face hunger, violence, death, rape to survive and to arrive here. So they're very resilient. But it's also very important for us to remember, after escaping all of that, they arrive in our streets and in our neighborhoods, and the safety that they sought may not be available to them once they arrive here. So again, look at the refugee trends, at the numbers. We are going to look at the numbers. If right now we're looking at a slide that says trends from 2012 to 2014. If you look at the numbers in 2012, there were a little over 58,000 refugees that arrived in the U.S. In 2013, approximately almost 70,000. In 2014, again, almost the same numbers. And in 2014, which is the last year that we have data for the U.S., the numbers we have are very small. That's because it takes a long time and to actually get the numbers. But you can see there is a ceiling that the government sets, and around 70 some refugees per year is what we get in the U.S. Next slide. Again, if we think about where are those refugees going, you can see that they are actually in many places in the United States. They are all over. They're in the West, they're in the South, they're in the North. There are some states that got more, there are some states that got less, but they are really spread, and one of the reasons that they are spread is actually the refugee resettlement program. The United States has actually one of the best and most organized refugee resettlement program in the sense of the government brings people here, it places them in different places, it makes sure that different states get different numbers so that they are spread. It has programs and agencies like we just mentioned, Refugee and Immigrant Assistance Center, which is an agency here in Boston that we collaborate with. They are a resettlement agency, meaning they receive refugees. So refugees are in all our states, and so if you are a provider working with youth, or if you are a teacher, or if you are a clinician, you are most likely going to see a refugee. Next slide. Now, if we ask the question of which states get the most, where do they go? Which states do they go? States like Texas actually have a high number of refugees, California, New York, Arizona, Ohio, Michigan. So the top states are many times states with a lot of population. Refugees are looking for work. They're looking for places that are more urban. So Washington, New York, California, Texas have all got big numbers. And it's really good to keep in mind where they're going. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, why are we focusing on refugees? Why this is special, folks? Why are we having this discussion? First of all, as we mentioned before, millions of people are displaced worldwide each year. More than half of those are children. And more refugees are arriving in the West. They are arriving in our neighborhoods, as we just saw. In addition, many have experienced severe trauma and are at risk for developing PTSD and other mental health issues and psychological stressors. And also, the very nature of being a refugee implies that there is exposure to trauma, that there is an exposure to violence. And more importantly, the term refugee has the notion that one has found a refuge, a safe haven. So when those refugees arrive in our neighborhoods, in our communities, they have realized a lifetime dream of finding a refuge. Being resettled in the U.S. does not guarantee a refuge, though. It does not relieve them of violence. And this is what we are really talking about today. After 20, 30, 15 years of being in a refugee camp and waiting for that safety, for opportunities, educational opportunities, for employment opportunities, when they arrive in our neighborhoods, they, as the person that we quote in our title says, they feel like they have left one war and come to another. And so that's why we are focusing on this group. Furthermore, refugees spend, as I said, many years waiting for this this promised land, the United States. All they know about the United States and refugee camps is what they see on TV. They actually say that. That's all they know is like big cars, big houses, luxury life is, and then they come here and they are in neighborhoods where they are hearing gunfire and their kids are being attacked, and so they are back to war. So that is why we are focusing on this group, because they come from one violence and they're coming to another. And also we are focusing on this group because violence exposure puts youth at risk for myriad of negative outcomes. And refugee youth merit a special attention because they have unique exposure, multiple exposures to violence. And also, more importantly, due to cultural and linguistic barriers, refugee youth and their families often do not seek mental health help. So it's really important, it's imperative that we understand what are the patterns, first of all, what are the issues that these youth and their families face. and what are their patterns, help-seeking patterns, what are the barriers they're facing, what are the best practices, how can we support them? Because otherwise, those youth are really at risk for a bad outcome, for violence, not only for being exposed to violence, but for themselves perpetuating that violence. And that's why we are focusing on this special group. Thank you. Next one. When thinking about youth in general, it's helpful to draw on the socio-ecological model originally developed by Urie, Bronfenbrenner. What this model shows is that the developing child is embedded within layers of social ecology. A child is part of a family. They are part of a school community. They have peer groups in which they interact, with which they interact and that they relate to. They live in neighborhoods, and they also live in wider communities. They live in cultures. They live in nations. So we need to think about the child we're looking at in that context. If we focus on a refugee youth, next slide, please. If we focus on the refugee youth, we know that disruptions happen in many layers of the social ecology of that child. We know that the child himself or herself has experienced trauma personally. We know that the family, there's a loss in the family, that there has been a separation from family, disruption in the family structure, loss of family roles. For example, a parent is no longer able to provide the kind of protection and support that the child needs. That there is a disruption is what we call the basic scaffolding of childhood. The very things that provide support and structure for a child are disrupted. There is the child's own identity and beliefs are targeted, which is why the child is actually a refugee. Many times it's because of your identity, because of who you are. That I want to actually read something that my colleague and our director of our center, Dr. Heidi Ellis, wrote about this and actually used in a previous webinar, because I think it really explains this. So she says, let's think a minute about the social ecology of a refugee child as they go through the process of leaving their country to another place. Refugee children have frequently experienced profound disruptions across all layers of their social ecology. So thinking about migration and pre-migration at the individual level, many youth have experienced horrific traumas at the family level. We can see that some children have experienced separation from their caregivers at crucial times when things are frightening and potentially unsafe. And some of them have lost their family members. Within the broader community, they have often experienced what we call the disruption, as I said before, of the scaffolding of childhood. Essentially, the structures we assume to be in place to support a growing child, such as adequate nutrition, healthcare, school systems, and safe neighborhoods, have been torn apart. And finally, at the level of culture, people become refugees because their very identity and beliefs are targeted. So that's what happens to those youth before they even come to our streets. Next slide, please. And so what happens is we have just heard what those children go through before they come to our streets, before they come to our neighborhoods. What about what about after they have arrived here? And again, I'm actually going to read Heidi's writing on this, which I think is really it's very clear and very good way to explain this. So if we move to when the children are here, what we call a resettlement, the refugee word, as I said before, contains within it the idea of refuge, a safe harbor from dangers that lead to leaving one's country. But unfortunately, even after resettlement, we continue to see profound disruptions throughout the social ecology of that child. At the individual level, trauma continues to play a role. Not only do some children struggle with after effects of the trauma experienced before coming here, but many also contend with violence in the United States, including family violence and community violence. At the level of the family, you see the effects of intergenerational trauma. Parents often struggle with the effects of trauma, their own trauma, and this may interfere with their capacity to parent or take care of their children, or to support or even create a safe environment for their children. Some children arrive without their family members and must be content with the loss and integration into a new family system. And within many families, acculturation is a major stressor. And so we have to keep that in mind for those children. We also think about how do those children find safety in their neighborhood schools? How do they think safe? How do they find safety in their schools? They are struggling with learning. They're struggling with learning a new language. They may have lost many years of school. There might be family violence due to the violence already experienced. There is a continuous loss because even though they themselves are here and supposedly safe, they're still hearing about loss and killing and death of family members overseas. So once they come here, the children are still facing many things. In addition to that, we are talking about many children of color. They're facing discrimination. They're facing unemployment of a parent or even a parent's incapacity, inability to handle the stressors of a new country and new culture. So all of those. So the child arrives here looking for a safe harbor, but they are actually still struggling. Their families are still struggling. But in addition to all of that, they're living in streets and in communities where there is additional violence. Next slide. And this is why we, in our title and in our presentation, we are talking about this idea of the double-edged sword. Again, those children who have sought a safe harbor, who came to our communities looking for relief from violence, come here. And the data shows that, first of all, that having been exposed to previous trauma, they are at risk for negative outcomes such as PTSD, depression, risky behaviors. And then having that children who actually come here, so war trauma in itself puts those youth at risk for negative outcomes. But children who are just exposed to community violence are also at risk for negative outcomes, such as greater psychological stressors. And now you have a a refugee child who is exposed to both. They bring war trauma not only for themselves, but their parents, their family, their community, and then they come here and they're additionally exposed to community violence. Next slide. And we thought we will share some numbers. So we're using two different data. We're actually using data from our own data that we have done. We've done extensive research led by Dr. Heidi Alves with Somali youth here, and we have looked at violence in many different violence exposure in its many forms. But we're also using a data that has been published by Ertol in 2000 that looked at Khmer youth and there. And we thought that having those two different findings that show the levels of trauma exposure of refugee youth might be helpful to participants to see side by side and see how high those are. So, for example, if we look at the top 4 exposures of trauma overseas for Khmer youth, we're looking at murder of family members. So 76% said that they had either a family member or a friend killed. 16% said that they have witnessed that themselves. Unnatural death of family or friends, again, the same very high number, 72%. This is, again, is overseas during the war. 72% that had direct experience of this. 17% actually witnessed it. On the other hand, if you look at while they were in the U.S., the top traumas were things like being chased by gang members. Almost 40% of those children said that they were chased, that they themselves were chased. But almost 60% said that they have witnessed gang members chasing other youth. That they were threatened with a weapon. 30% of those youth have said that they were threatened with a weapon. That there were family violence, that they were hit by a family member. Almost 30% of those youth said that they themselves had experienced that. So this is really, you can see that these youth had, as we talked about, both overseas high traumas, but also in the United States, they continue to experience those high traumas. Next one, please. And this is, like I said, from our own data set with Dr. Alice. which we have just published one article on, and we have another one in press, and we continue to analyze. And this is also a Somali youth longitudinal research, so we are not just looking at one time point, we will be looking at multiple time points. So what were the top things that violence exposures for this group of youth? Seeing someone kill, 36%, almost 37% of those youth endorsed that they have seen someone killed, but over 50% of those witnessed it here, not in the war, that they will themselves be killed, or feeling that they believe that they will be hurt or seriously hurt. About 34% endorsed this, but again, over essentially 55% of those who did endorse it said that it was in the United States. The last two, which is very interesting, carrying arms to defend oneself or family, the 8% who endorsed this, almost all of them said that this had happened in the U.S. And the same, that witnessing armed combat, which literally is watching people shoot at each other, so it could be gang shooting at each other or war. Majority of kids saw it here. So this is really important, that those youth are experiencing major traumas here in the United States, in our communities, as part of the community violence. Next. What are risk factors for exposure to violence in the U.S., or what we call post-migration? This is researched by many different people, but the finding is that some of the risk factors include being a minority, which many refugees are, lower socioeconomic status, which many refugees are, living in inner city, which many refugees do, absent father, which in our data set, over 50% of the youth we interviewed had an absent father, so a high level, at least for the Somali youth that we know. Re-victimization, refugee youth have that in their experience, as we just talked about. And again, poly-victimization, again, that's something that's very much in the refugee experience. So what this shows us is that if we just look in general, what puts youth at risk for violent exposure, refugee youth have actually many of those, meet many of those characteristics. And so they are very much likely to be at risk for exposure to violence. Next, please. We just looked at, this is just post-resettlement in the U.S., again, looking at different research findings about youth and community violence. And this very famous research, inner city Chicago, witnessed homicide rates at similar rates to youth who were in Mozambique refugee camps. So youth who were in inner city Chicago having similar homicide witnessing rates as youth who were in Mozambique, who were actually refugees, who were had a history of war. The Khmer youth, that from the data I mentioned before, the community violence exposure in the U.S. rather than overseas war trauma accounts for the PTSD. So youth who were exposed to violence, community violence here, were more likely to have PTSD than youth who were actually exposed to trauma overseas. And the Somali youth that we've done our research in our sample had higher levels of exposure to traumatic events here in the U.S. than pre-migration or in Somalia or during the refugee camps. Essentially what it's saying is, number one, community violence here can sometimes be really what the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. So even though you've had refugee war exposure and traumatic events in their lives, it is the addition of this violence that sometimes is maybe leading to higher levels of negative outcomes, of trauma, PTSD, of depression, and so on. So it's really important to say, A, we have a really high number of trauma, violent exposure for our youth here, and refugee youth, because of their previous exposure and because maybe of other things, are more likely to have higher negative outcome when they are here if they are exposed to higher levels of traumatic events. Next. Consequences for traumatic stress or exposure, we were going to look, we think that it's important to look at socially what is it, and it's an increased risk for drug abuse, isolation, for interpersonal relationship problems, and so on and so forth. For psychologically, an increased risk for mental illness, as we saw, PTSD, depression, and so on. And academically, risk for learning problems, for school dropouts, for failure. Next. Again, looking at the threshold data, approximately, if we look at the psychological impact of exposure to violence for refugee youth, from the Khmer data we talked about before, approximately 1 in 3 met the criteria for PTSD. Length of stay in the U.S. was possibly correlated with PTSD. Again, I think in that data it's also because that it was actually more responsible. Exposure to violence here was responsible for higher PTSD. 63% of participants had symptoms indicative of major depression. Community violence exposure in the U.S. rather than overseas war traumas accounted for the PTSD, as I said before. Greater life exposure to violence was correlated with higher PTSD. Of course, community violence exposure has also been associated with violent actions by adolescents and other risky behaviors. And this is actually true also of our own data set, that youth with higher exposure to community violence were more likely themselves to engage in violent behaviors. And in the Somali data set that we have, nearly 2 in 3 of the youth reported significant PTSD symptoms, and 1 in 3 is screened positive for full PTSD. Younger age and length of stay in the U.S. were associated with more negative outcomes. Next. What are the risk factors for mental health problems in refugee youth? So we have 3 different sorts of domains: parental factors, child factors, and environmental factors. Parental PTSD, maternal depression, torture, death or separation from parents, direct observation of parental helplessness, parental unemployment, parental underestimation of stress on children. So all of those were factors for mental health problems for youth. The child factor, number of traumas, again, we talked about that. In our data, earlier data with the Somali youth, there were up to 22 trauma exposure events. And you can imagine how that can relate to number of more problems, mental health problems. Expressive language of difficulties, PTSD, physical or health problems, or older age. And then environmental factors, number of transitions. Again, that's really key because refugee youth have multiple transitions. And many times when they come here, they end up homeless. They move from shelter to shelter, and all of those things can relate to that. Poverty, time taken for immigration status to be determined. Now that may be in the U.S., is not a problem for refugees, but overseas it is. It takes up to 10 to 20 years for people to get their status to come here. Cultural isolation, period of time in refugee camps, that again is key in our samples that we look at. It is up to 20 years, 10 to 20 years most of the time, and time in the host country. Next. We can't keep talking about problems or risk factors. We really need to understand what are some of the protective factors and also think about how do we promote those protective factors. What are things that make kids more resilient? And again, if we look at those 3 different domains, there is a parental factor that is protective. This is high parental support and high family cohesion. Same ethnic origin foster care. So if a child is in a foster care, putting them in a foster care within their ethnic group. Family attachment and stability. Now, I will talk about this later, but the problem is sometimes refugee experience and migration and loss and trauma actually may fracture those very important protective factors. What are the child factors? Social skills, biculturalism, role of religion, academic engagement, academic achievement, all of those can be protected for a child. Community factors, self-reported report of support from friends. So if a child says, like, I have a lot of friends in the community, self-reported positive school experience, ethnic-based service organizations. So if they have community agencies that essentially support the family, and so introduced what we call, and Alicia will talk about this more, but resettlement hassles. If the family has support, then the child and the parents, there is a less stress at the home, and the child and parents can have a lot more positive interaction. Next. So if we look at the two groups we talked about, specifically what they reported for the Khmer refugee adolescents from Persol research, greater social support from family significantly contributed to lower level of personal risk behavior. Self-perception of social support, so if children thought that they had greater social support from friends, was negatively correlated with levels of PTSD and levels of depression, so those were protected. For our youth that we did the research with here, is stronger social bonds, so either the Somali or the broader American community, and civic engagement. Youth who felt that they could do something about their lives, that they could contribute to society, have been shown to be more protected. Next. And if we look at the school, how does this exposure to violence impact youth at the school, their learning, their social relations, their peer relations at school? Again, the Khmer research showed that community violence exposure in the United States impacted Khmer refugee CBA. So youth who were exposed to more violence had lower CBAs. Khmer refugee adults with greater lifetime exposure to violence reported lower CBAs, grade point averages, and average participant CBA was 2.77. Females had higher CBAs than males, which again can actually relate to exposure to violence, because in our own data set, and I think many other research in refugee youth, males are more likely to have higher levels of exposure to violence than females, and adolescents with lower exposure to violence had higher CBAs. Next. In our own data set, with the Somali youth, higher levels of sense of school belonging were significantly associated with lower levels of symptoms of PTSD and depression, and higher levels of self-efficacy. Adolescents who experience more attachment, personal investment in school, for example, commitment, involvement, and belief in their school, attain higher levels of self-efficacy. So youth who had felt that they were more connected to the school, that they were more attached, that they were more involved. In other words, who had investment in the school had higher levels of self-efficacy, which then again meant lower levels of PTSD and depression. Next. So again, I mentioned this before, but I just want to really emphasize some of the key protective factors that will support refugee youth, such as strong social bonds, family support, and family support are often compromised due to war and migration. So the very things that youth, when they arrive here, need to stay strong, to stay out of violence, to succeed, to feel better, to have lower PTSD, and are actually the things that get compromised by war, migration, and violence. For example, families are fractured. Often, as I said, families arrive with absent father. The loss of social support in communities like the Somali or other communities where you have extended family taking care of a child. Here now you have a single parent taking care of a group of children. Acculturation stress is really important. Children becoming much more acculturated, much more faster. Parents not even being aware of what's out there. Many times when I work with parents, they tell me, the children say to us in our research that our parents have no idea what the streets are like. Our parents are worried about how we dress, and we're worried about whether we will come back alive. And so parents and really children being at different levels of understanding what it means to be here. And the acculturation gap, loss of ideas about what it is to be, for example, a Somali, between the parent and the child. And parental trauma and mental health, again, this is really important. The parents who themselves are experiencing the after effects of trauma, mental health issues, and are not receiving support, it can affect their capacity to nurture, their capacity to parent, their capacity to relate to their children's issues. So that's really, those are the things that are affected by that process. Next. To go back again to the social-ecological model that we have talked about, and to actually continue this discussion about looking at the child as a whole, I am now going to transfer this to my colleague, Dr. Alicia Miller.
Thank you, Saida. So as Saida just described, violence exposure, whether back home or here in the United States, puts refugee youth at risk for a variety of adjustment problems. But there is hope, tremendous hope. First of all, we can draw on the literature on resiliency, which suggests that productive factors such as opportunities and supports that promote healthy behavior are more predictive of adjustment than risk factors. So of course, going back to the socio-ecological model, we cannot think of previous trauma and violence exposure in isolation. Rather, we must think about trauma and violence exposure in the context of the social environment. Although we cannot change previous trauma, we can change the things in the social environment. And these layers of the social environment can in fact protect refugee children from the negative effects of violence exposure. So yes, trauma is important, but things like social support, social bonds, belongingness, among many other things at each of the layers, are protective. And all of us as individuals, community members, parents, teachers, service providers, case managers, law enforcement professionals, and others can be agents of change in the social environment and promote a healthy social ecology for these kids. Next slide, please. So our intervention work really began over a decade ago. At that time, Dr. Ellis, the director of our center, was working to develop a trauma-informed intervention for inner-city youth who lived in very stressed environments. At that same time, she also began to notice a pattern in which the referrals she was getting for clinical service. She was being presented with young Somali males who had been mandated to treatment before they could return to school. At that time, Dr. Ellis observed that these boys, one, had been born in Somalia, lived in refugee camps, and had horrific trauma histories. Two, didn't want to be in her office, and oftentimes their families didn't want the services as well. And last, third, had trouble functioning. They were coming in at a stage well beyond when they needed help. Now, if it weren't for the third observation, Dr. Ellis probably could have ignored the situation. But she wanted to serve them better. She wanted to help these youth. And it was that desire to understand that led to a research project that sought to answer the following questions. Do refugee adolescents need mental health services? Are they experiencing emotional distress? If so, are they receiving services? Where? From whom? What are the pathways to healing that the community engages? And if those pathways do not lead to the doors of our mental health clinics, what then? This is how our now over a decade-long community-based participatory project, Trauma Systems for Refugees, began here in Boston. Next slide, please. So, as we know from our research with the Somali youth, the answer to the first question on the previous slide is yes. Many refugee youth in the U.S. are experiencing emotional distress and do need mental health services. In her study, Dr. Ellis found that a large percentage, 94% of the youth, had been exposed to trauma, with an average of 7 traumatic events being reported. She also found that nearly 2/3 of the youth reported post-traumatic stress symptoms, and a third screened positive for full PTSD. Now, importantly, however, and important to note, is that a third did not report significant symptoms. Next slide, please. Now, of those who had reported high levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms, only 7% reported seeking out services. 92% had not accessed any formal mental health services at all. These significant unmet health needs are not unique to Somali refugees. Next slide, please. Refugee youth do not seek mental health services for a variety of reasons. Here are a couple of quotes from our qualitative interviews. Talking to a therapist, that's something we laugh at in our culture because we're like, why would you want to talk about your issues? Somalis don't seek therapy. And as a Somali person, I don't want to really say it has to do with religion, but most people, if they are having a bad day, they are more likely to pray and say God. That's how we deal with our emotions. Next slide, please. Refugee children often come to the United States with a history of trauma from their own country of origin. They then are faced with additional stressors such as acculturation, the process of adapting one's own culture to a new culture, and includes things like language and cultural learning, as well as disruption in traditional family dynamics. Refugee children and their families may also experience feelings of isolation in their new school, community, and society. Stressors related to the process of resettlement, such as accessing housing, healthcare, legal aid, and employment, can further compound these issues. Research suggests that stressors encountered in resettlement are important predictors of mental health problems. It is therefore important to broaden the lens through which refugee mental health is understood, from a focus on refugee trauma to an emphasis on refugee core stressors. These core stressors may have a multiplicative effect in that the experience of trauma pre-migration may be particularly difficult to recover from in the context of the ongoing stressors of acculturation, resettlement stress, and isolation. Next slide, please. Again, it's important to remember that despite all this, many refugee youth are doing well, are healthy, integrated, and very successful. It is a smaller but significant number that we want to make sure are doing well because we all know the stakes are very high. So again, turning to the socio-ecological model, a disruption in any one layer of the child's socio-ecology may create problems in another. For example, if a child is being discriminated by his or her peer group at school, that may create tension in his or her other social relationships, such as his or her parents or siblings at home. But at the same time, an intervention in one of those layers may also positively impact another layer. For example, if a child's teacher is taught about the refugee experience and the consequences of trauma on learning, he or she may begin to conceptualize the student's avoidance as mental health related instead of disrespect or disregard. Next slide, please. This slide delineates why mental health services weren't seen as helpful and why they weren't being accessed by refugee families, as well as the strategies we use to develop in our intervention to overcome them. The first is a distrust of authority or power, which comes from a legacy of a breakdown in government structure in a home country, along with the less than favorable treatment by authorities in a refugee camp, only to name a few. We sought to decrease this barrier by engaging community through building partnerships with gateway providers, religious and community leaders, and mental health professionals to help build trust. Second, the stigma of mental health services. An underlying stigma of mental illness, which may come from different explanatory models of mental illness, as well as different ideas about ways of healing. We sought to reduce this barrier by embedding services in existing systems, like schools, as a way to make sure that services were more acceptable by community members. Traditionally, refugee families highly value education. In addition, we were then able to reach refugee youth where they already were, and in an institution that families trust. Third, linguistic and cultural barriers. Services being inaccessible and inappropriate, which contributed to why services weren't seen as helpful. We sought to overcome this barrier by creating partnerships between providers and cultural experts from the community so that we could provide culturally and linguistically appropriate relevant care. And finally, the primacy of resettlement stressors. Mental illness is not a primary concern, especially for new arrivals who may be more focused on getting housing, gaining employment, learning English. I believe that services with refugee families often fail because clinicians and agencies have their own agendas, or they think they know what the community source of pain is, all the while missing the primary concerns, problems of the client, or the community, such as jobs, housing issues, childcare, transportation, etc. Next slide, please. Now we would like to show you a brief video.
There are a lot of refugee and immigrant communities in the United States. Many of these youth are coming here after having experienced incredible adversity and trauma. The resettlement process is really extremely difficult, and for some of them, they go on to develop mental health problems that can really interfere with their ability to be part of their communities.
If you have no provision for those children to express their sadness, they will express it in other ways.
The children's ability to be successful as learners is at stake. It was more like benign neglect. Differentiating between the naughtiness of a typical 13-year-old and a response to trauma takes a little bit of training. Sometimes we intervened with consequences when what was needed was mental health supports.
What we've done is embed our mental health services in a school system. Kids are coming anyway. The school system is really valued. Education's highly valued by families.
If I'm school-based, it's part of the school. It's part of the school day. Parents feel this is something that's acceptable and okay. We work a lot with teachers and social workers for children who may be needing extra intervention. If a child has had a trauma history, we are very much available to the teachers. We do trainings on trauma and culture, and we also do groups.
Within the school, we run groups for all the kids in the English language learners classroom.
What did you just say?
I just said I feel comfortable staying here.
You do? Okay. Do you think we can talk about goals that we have for the school year?
Yeah. To play soccer.
To play soccer.
Do you remember how we made the group goals last year? What do we want to accomplish?
Learn how to respect each other.
I like that.
To behave.
To behave.
No, I want to play this game.
color?
If a child begins to show significant mental health needs, it's a very easy next step to go up to the family and say, you know, we've been meeting with so-and-so in the group. He's really benefiting from it. I think you might really also benefit from meeting individually. And in fact, maybe we could work with your family also. Here's what we're seeing and here's what we're thinking we might do.
We were talking about talking to mom more. He worries a lot about her, and if we can start a communication where we actually ease his anxiety by talking about how safe mom is, reframing his concern.
It makes perfect sense. If he comes from a refugee camp where he was in chronic danger, he's walking home from school, he's in chronic danger, why would he believe that anyone in his family is safe until we actually address the core issue of safety? So I'll be curious.
It's so important that when you create a program, it takes into consideration the way that people relate to each other in a culture. Especially when we're talking about the needs of children, that we're expecting parents to trust us, caring for their children, helping their children. We want them to know we are there for the family.
There were no Somali social workers in the entire state of Massachusetts before we started this program. We partnered with Boston University School of Social Work, and they provided 2 full scholarships and mentoring and training to 2 individuals from the Somali community.
So then they all talked about how in Somalia there is healthy and mad. But then in America you have depressed, anxiety, you have all these things.
And there's no Somali definition of those words. And that's
One of the big successes for us has been that we've started to have families ask for services, saying, how can I get my child in to be part of this program?
maya behaviorka other schools jiro Boston programkan ma laga yaabaa ina aad balaarisaan oo
gabdhaha dhaqan ku dhagan ya
macnaha iskuulka markaas ay soo galaan miiska iskaga istaagi jireen ma ay aqoon
These kids are part of our communities, and kids in our communities do well. We all do well.
So these kids are part of our communities. And if the kids in our communities are doing well, then we are all doing well. Oh, can you turn the slide? So as was mentioned in the video, in TSTR, safety comes first. We believe it is equally important to assess a child's social environment as it is his or her self-regulation. The TSTR team is really charged to be vigilant about assessing risk and being proactive about addressing safety. Just good clinical care. In addition, as we've been discussing throughout this webinar and was also mentioned in the video, if a refugee child is experiencing new threats in their environment, if it is perceived as dangerous, any other targeted intervention or treatment except that safety, reducing that risk, will be ineffective. Next slide, please. TSTR is based on a public health model in which resources are strategically placed to benefit most people, and there is a continuum of care. The first and broadest level of care involves prevention in the form of community outreach to engage families and develop trust between communities and providers before a specific mental health need is identified. Mental health information is made available, and efforts are made to destigmatize seeking care. Information about the support that programs can offer is discussed in informal ways. Through informal discussion and understanding of the community's sources of pain are gathered. The second level of care is non-clinical skill-building groups. Whole populations of youth, like all 8th grade Somali girls, are invited to be part of a group so that it will be non-stigmatizing. This enables the group facilitators to begin to know families and build trust. Families buy into the idea of supporting their kids' emotional well-being and school success. And quite frankly, students buy in because the group is really fun. It also provides a safe venue to discuss acculturation issues. This level allows for early identification of needs in a non-stigmatizing way. So can we reach the kids before they're getting themselves into trouble? The third level involves intensive intervention. Those youth who demonstrate significant mental health needs receive community-based treatment under a trauma systems therapy model. At this stage, we have already developed a solid relationship with families, and they begin to see us as people who are trying to make a difference in not only their children's education, but also invested in the whole family. The critical element that is added to the TSTR model from TST is the cultural brokering component that is incorporated into each of these service elements. The cultural broker is involved at every level. Next slide, please. TSTR adds a fifth element of services of cultural brokering, like I just mentioned, to trauma systems therapy's 4 service elements, which include skill-based therapy, psychopharmacology, service advocacy, and home-based services. Next slide, please. Cultural brokers are professionals who combine intimate community-level knowledge and experience with an understanding of mental health services and supports in order to facilitate access for cultural minority communities and to improve care. They are people who are usually respected and trusted members of their community and who possess intimate cultural knowledge and insight, as well as professional and academic background or interest in mental health. They are advocates for members of their community who help clients navigate cross-cultural differences in order to access services and support. In TSTR, cultural brokers are a partner to the clinician, a conduit between the clinician and the client. In the context of TSTR, cultural brokering is initiated through community outreach and engagement. Through the process of cultural brokering, cultural brokers and their clinician partners are able to improve communication and build trust between their clients and service systems. These improvements help ensure that clients get the quality care they deserve. Cultural brokers are the bridge between service providers and the refugee communities they serve. They are the face of TSTR. Next slide, please. Using cultural brokers help improve mental health access and quality of care for refugee communities. This is accomplished through the trusting relationships that cultural brokers form with clients, which in turn contributes to improved communication and client understanding about treatment they are receiving. When a client is able to effectively communicate his or her concerns and needs to a cultural broker, and in turn clinicians, then clinicians can accurately assess and treat clients, creating a more positive experience for the clients as well as increasing engagement. This process enriches the knowledge base of community members and mental health providers both, and can help reduce the stigma of using mental health treatment in refugee communities. Finally, organizations that use cultural brokers help develop the human resource capacity of refugee communities through the hiring and training of community members who are then equipped to help others reach their full potential. Next slide, please. So just briefly, our data evaluation of Project Shifa in Boston demonstrated that for children in individual therapy, greatest PTSD improvement occurred over the first 6 months and depression improvement over 1 year. Change in PTSD was predicted by change in post-ward hardships, suggesting that focusing on stressors that affect family stability may be key for interventions with refugee youth. And at the conclusion of the intervention, those who had received services had improved to the point that their symptom levels were similar to those who had not required services. In addition, community-wide acceptance of the program led to increased parent involvement in the schools and a very active family advisory board. The program had 100% engagement and treatment among youth referred for services, and perhaps the best indicator of success was that family and youth started self-referring themselves to the program. Now I would like to turn the discussion back over to Saida for some concluding remarks. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So we want to give you a few takeaways. I think as we have seen with the experience of Dr. Heidi Alves, whether you practice in urban and even in rural settings, refugee youth and their families will show up at your door needing services. And the question is not whether you will have them coming to see you, but what will you do with them? How will you approach them? The second takeaway we would like to share with you is how important it is to understand the high levels of violence exposure among this population, whether it's wartime violence, or violence in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods, and how this exposure impacts refugee youth and their social support, refugee youth and their families in their school systems, in all the communities in which they're embedded. So it's really important to remember this, that they're a very special population because not only do they bring an experience of violence, but that there is even more violence waiting for them here. And we also want to really emphasize the thought or the importance of service provision that includes the assessment of trauma history, both current and historical. So looking at the wartime trauma, migration trauma, refugee camp trauma, but also looking in the context of an ongoing resettlement and acculturation stressors. So not just asking, have you seen violence in the war, but are you seeing violence in your neighborhood? Are you seeing violence in your home? Because this is really relevant for this population. Finally, it's crucial to create service systems that are tailored to meet the unique needs of this population of refugee youth and their families in order to promote and enhance engagement in mental health services. We really, in our project that Alicia just talked about at TSDR, and in our work with many different providers, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of looking at the culture, at the language, but also at what we call the sources of pain. A family that has gone through multiple traumas and has experienced multiple violence, or a child who has gone through that, may not see mental health as an important thing, but they may come to you looking for housing help. But so engaging them culturally, engaging them linguistically, but also engaging them in context. If they're showing up at your door and they're saying, my child is a bad child, that's why I'm here, because they got kicked out of the school, engage them in that, because that may be the only explanation they will provide. So we wanted to give you those ideas or thoughts as a takeaway from here. Thank you. And now I'm going to give it. Thank you, and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Can you change it to the next slide, please, to the resources slide? Would either of you like to talk about this particular list of resources, or should we go ahead and go into question and answer?
Yeah, let's just go into question and answer since we have a shorter amount of time, but we would like to leave this resource list up so people could take notes if they're interested.
Great. Well, Saida, Alicia, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. What a wonderful set of discussion or pieces of information today. So now we'll turn it over to the question and answer section of the webinar. We have some good questions coming in here. And just a reminder to participants, the format of this presentation does not allow you to speak directly to presenters, but you may ask a question at any point by clicking the blue button labeled Ask a Question on the screen, or by sending an email to question at nctsn.org. So we have a question here from Sarah. Realizing that refugees come from a variety of countries and their communities are unique, can you speak to some of the ways refugee families talk about or understand community violence? How do they experience community violence?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Sarah. So I would say I'm going to answer first, and then I'll have Saida join in. But I think what we understand is that refugee families, the refugee families that we work with, really don't understand community violence, at least the way that we understand it, those who have been born here in the U.S. And just remember, as we've talked about, many refugee families are really escaping from really extreme traumatic events in their native land. And so violence that occurs here in the U.S. May neither happen as frequently or may appear to be less traumatic. But some refugee families think that violence happens also just in these, like it's just a fact of life that they happen in these urban communities that are related to poverty, and that there's really nothing that can be done about it. So, hold on.
Again, thank you, Sarah, for asking, because this is really an important question. And I want to actually divide the refugee family into a child and a parent. What we find with many of the families, and actually we work with multiple cultures. We presented the Somali, but we work with Bhutanese and we work with other communities. One of the really salient things for providers and people who work with these families is that youth know what's out there because they are out there. But many families and parents may actually see a youth who got caught up in violence as being bad kids. Like they think that you should not be interacting with people with guns. Like, why were you where the gun is or where the shooting was? So they may actually blame the child for being exposed to that violence because they think that in the U.S. at least you are able to stay away from violence. And I think this is really important for the children. It's a really catch-22. Many times children are very protective of their parents, so they may not even share the amount of violence that they face in the street. We have kids that here, even in Boston, who are actually terrified to walk from their home to their school. But they may never share that with their parents because especially with a single mother, because they don't want to burden the parents, because they know that their parents does not understand it, does not know anything about it, may not be able to help it the way they feel, so they may never share with that. So there is actually, it contributes to families having secrets from each other because the parent is yelling at the child saying, someone stole your sneakers, for example, because that happens often to our kids, and the parent is yelling at them saying, you were with bad kids, that's why you lost your sneakers. And the child may be protecting the parent and will just keep everything, the pain and the fear to themselves, especially boys, because they are very afraid of expressing fear, like it's not manly.
We have another question here from Borka. How do refugees understand the link between violence and mental health in your experience?
Thank you. Let's see. I would say that there's not an explicit understanding between the link between violence and mental health. I think I would just generally say that perhaps refugee families understand violence as something that needs to be resolved or dealt with personally, and that mental health issues would be resolved in a different factor if at all, if mental health issues are recognized. Definitely, community violence may not be seen as a problem that can be fixed, but just more of part of the environment. And now I'll hand this over to Saida.
So again, I think this is a great question because it actually speaks to one of the key things that we've spoken about, which is culture and how you explain things. What are the explanatory methods or that communities use? So, for example, in our video actually that came up, a lot of communities don't see mental health, if you think about trauma and PTSD, as being that someone with faith should suffer. For example, if you're a Muslim, the community I work with Somalis and Muslims, they will say that if you had faith, then you will not be having any symptoms related to trauma because this is something that God has will on you, this bad thing that happened to you, i.e. the violence or the trauma, and so you should have patience and you should not be. So if I am explaining to a parent and I'm saying, you know what, your child is suffering because they have PTSD, because of this bad thing that happened, the parents will say, why would they have that? My child should have faith and let God deal with it. So there is really this idea of violence leading to mental health. Mental health is seen as something that's spiritual, and if you have a good spiritual connection to God, you should not be having those worries and these symptoms. And so it's very important for us. Many times when I work with families, I actually use the body as the explanation. I say to them that the mind is just like the leg. If the leg breaks, it suffers, and it actually shows the sign of breakage. We have to mend it, then we have to see slowly move until it heals. And actually, that really helps because it helps them see that the brain is impacted in the same way by violence and trauma. So it is a very important question because many times they don't make a connection. I will give you an example of what a parent said to me. They said to me, my child has a bed, they have breakfast, they have a classroom, they have a pen and pencil. Why are they suffering? Because the war is gone. So, and it's actually a way of survival. Let go of the trauma. Don't think about it, not knowing that that is not sometimes possible.
We have a question from Matt, who says he works in refugee resettlement. Can you speak to gender differences in addressing the impact of community violence?
Thank you. That's an awesome question as well. And what I'd like to say just generally is, and traditionally, I think with refugee families, what we see is that girls, at least initially, really serve more in a traditional role. They're at home. They're intended to be at home. They're not encouraged to go outside of the family. And so the impact that might have on them may be less, whereas boys oftentimes are encouraged to go out to be part of the larger community more so than girls, and so come into contact more often, I think, with the community violence. That being said, I think also that there are gender differences in how community violence or just issues in general are talked about. Kind of alluding to what Saida was talking about earlier as well. There's kind of a parent view that you can take, right? So you have the mom view and that versus the dad view, and then you can also take the child's view and look at the differences between girls and boys. And I would venture to say that everyone's talking about it and talks about these issues. Women may talk more with women about it. Men may talk more with men. Girls may talk amongst themselves, and boys may talk separately. And I'll pass this over to Saida now.
I also want to go back to something I said again about the idea of why were you there, like parents feeling like children can avoid community violence, because if you are not in a bad place, this is doubly so for girls. I think, it would be, a disservice to all girls if we did not mention, sexual violence, girls who are victims of sexual violence. In many refugee communities, there are high levels of sexual violence in the refugee camps during migration, but also when girls come here. And one of the reasons that is because there is no space for girls to talk about. So I will also say that girls have less exposure maybe to the community violence because they may not be out there as much, but they are actually more exposed to family violence, and they're more exposed to violence, historical violence, and they are less likely to have spaces where they can seek help. We find with the youth we work with that boys behave sorts of outward express anger, so they behave violently in school, in the neighborhood, and so they're more likely actually to become system involved, and for example in school to be identified for mental health services. Girls internalize cut, suicide, and so they don't. Many of the girls that we work with in our project are girls that we found because of our group work, not because people were running to us with a paper saying she needs help. That's because girls internalize a lot. So.
Oh, and I'd like to just add something as well. Another kind of aspect to this is that I think it's important to think about as resettlement and integration into the larger community happens, that over time, the longer that refugee youth are here, those differences may go away as far as girls might be out there more and experiencing more. And, you know, as there's a term that is used called the immigrant paradox, whereas immigrants come to the U.S., they become more Americanized, meaning that they get into more trouble and unhealthy. And so that really protective nature of culture and community is gone. It leaves them. And so I think that that's a very important aspect to keep in mind as you are a newly arrived refugee child is going to have a very different experience than one who has been here for a couple of years. And so as a clinician, as providers, we need to keep that lens. Okay, thank you.
And this is something that you spoke to earlier in the presentation, but we had a question come in anonymously. Can you talk about the process of the trauma narrative with refugee youth and if this is of pressing importance?
I'll speak to this first. In my experience in consulting with different agencies and clinicians across the nation, really, I think when people hear, especially people who are trauma-informed or feel that they're trauma-informed, it can be they hear refugee, they think trauma, they feel like they could really make a huge impact by processing the trauma narrative with a refugee. And so they feel like, this is great, we know how to do this. And really what I would encourage is to slow down. Really address the safety first, right? You can't have somebody processing a trauma narrative if they don't have the skills in place to deal with it. And so what I would say is to slow down. It sounds sexy and seductive to really go there, but it's not necessarily warranted. Perhaps immediately. It may be down the line, but I think just using good clinical judgment about that is imperative. Here's Sylvia.
I think, so I just want to add one difference. I'm going to take a different take on this because I think when the person asks the question, it's interesting. You can think about trauma narrative in two different ways. You can think about the clinical trauma narrative where we process narrative, the trauma with the patient to help them to overcome the triggers. But you can also think about trauma narrative within families. How do families and communities talk about trauma? And one of the interesting findings in one of the articles we were quoting was that families in which there's a healthy discussion about the trauma are actually families that are more resilient. That youth that are more resilient have families where the trauma experience of the family, of the parents, for example, is talked about, is contextualized. It really, I've worked with refugees for 20 years. Rarely have I seen many families where the trauma history is talked about. Not only in families that I work with, but even staff in our office whose families have gone through this. When I talk to them and I ask them, have your parents ever talked to you about being from Vietnam and having gone through the war? They are like, no, I just found out when I was graduating from college. So because many families actually are protective of their children, this is how they see protection. they will say, many parents will say to you, I have gone through this horrible experience. There is no reason to put this on my child. I'm going to be forward-looking into the future, whatever is done. And not knowing, again, as I said, the impact, the psychological impact that this past is with you, it's part of you. It is going to come out in some way. So if that's what the narrative we're talking about, then no. And I think we have to help the refugee parents to learn that telling their children their experience may be a much healthier way to relate to their child, and may be helpful for the child to understand their parents' experience and maybe their parents' actions right now.
Thank you.
And we're close to the end of our presentation, so let's just answer one last question here. What is the role of the refugee community in healing?
I think I'm going to take that since I am part of the refugee community. Great. It is actually very huge. I was doing a presentation about a month and a half ago around resilience. And I was talking about how resilience is something that rises out of communities. That it's not something given to us. It's something that we create for ourselves. And yes, we can provide the clinical knowledge. We can provide data. We can build systems that support refugee communities. But ultimately, the health and mental health and the resilience of those communities, in large part, is in their hands. And I think that's the importance of having, for example, what we call CBOs, or community-based organizations. Those are community agencies that have the language, they have the culture. They are able to help the refugee families navigate systems, school systems, health systems, social systems. Those are really important. Having refugee success stories, people who have gone to college, coming back to their community, helping youth understand that there is a way out. I have said, if you are resettled in a community here where there is violence, failure, school failure, and if you're a refugee youth who have never been exposed to alternative life is here, that's all you know. I mean, we have organized in some of our programs where we take kids, we have community members take kids to Harvard. We actually have Harvard medical or Harvard students, undergraduate students who are themselves refugees and immigrants, come and take other refugee and immigrant youth and meet them and tell them about how they have succeeded. So the refugee community has a huge role in the healing, partially by actually supporting families. But when we have mental health in our own organizations, within our own CBOs, which even have here, our Refugee and Immigrant Assistance Center, the agency that we work with, has a mental health clinic now. The access is much greater because they have the language, the culture, all the other support that the refugees need. So if you're Bhutanese or Somali or Iraqi and you need mental health, you go to an agency where there is someone who speaks your language right there who will support you. So they have a huge role to play, and we should be promoting their participation in the healing process. Here, hold one second.
Hi, this is Alicia, and I would just like to re-emphasize exactly what Saida said, that the refugee communities have a major, major role to play in the healing of their community members. And it's one of the reasons that we really incorporate outreach and engagement at the preventative level. We really want to build the resources from within the community. So when a community member has a loved one who's directly impacted or that they're concerned about, that they can seek help and get educated about what's going on, and they feel like they have a solution. And so, again, that's why we have chosen to do that in our program, and we believe that that is critical to the success to engagement. And also, we want to build from within so that clinicians are not seen as outsiders and providers are not seen as outsiders. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to our audience members for your thoughtful questions. Before we conclude, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters to share some final thoughts. Moderator, next slide, please.
Thank you, and thank you again to everybody who have participated in the webinar today. We appreciate being able to share our thoughts and our work. So our final thought, what we'd like to leave you with is a quote from Antonio Guterres of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And he says, while every refugee story is different and their anguish personal, they all share a common thread of uncommon courage. The courage not only to survive, but to persevere and rebuild their shattered lives. Thank you again.
Thank you again to our presenters and audience, and please remember to complete the post-presentation evaluation. This concludes today's presentation.